Kitsch, you ever notice that the people who matter most are usually the ones nobody notices at all? The first scream came from somewhere behind row 23, sharp enough to slice through the steady hum of the engines, and within seconds dozens of frightened voices blended into a wall of confusion as heads turned toward the left side of the aircraft. Phones appeared almost instantly. Faces pressed against the windows. Outside, less than 200 yards away, a sleek gray F-35 Lightning II drifted into perfect formation with the commercial airliner, its angular silhouette shimmering beneath the afternoon sun over the Nevada desert. Another fighter appeared moments later above the right wing, matching speed so precisely that it looked frozen against the endless blue sky. Mothers held their children closer. A businessman whispered that military jets only escorted civilian aircraft when something had gone terribly wrong. Someone farther back began praying under his breath. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisle with practiced smiles that failed to hide the concern in their eyes. Yet amid the growing panic, one passenger remained completely still. Walter Bennett sat quietly in seat 16A beside the window, his faded burgundy jacket folded neatly across his lap despite the turbulence beginning to rattle the cabin. His silver hair caught the sunlight spilling through the glass, and the reflection concealed his pale blue eyes from anyone watching nearby. He wasn't staring directly at the fighter. Instead, he watched its shadow glide across the polished aluminum wing outside. His breathing never changed. His hands never trembled. He simply tilted his head ever so slightly, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Then, almost too softly for anyone nearby to notice, he spoke. "The one on the left is carrying live missiles." The words reached only the young man seated across the aisle, who immediately looked toward him with disbelief before laughing nervously. "How would you even know that?" he muttered, assuming the old man was guessing. Walter offered no answer. His attention remained fixed beyond the glass, where the lead fighter adjusted its position by only a few feet before settling back into flawless alignment. Up front, inside the cockpit, First Officer Ethan Cole scanned instrument after instrument. Every display insisted the aircraft was operating within normal limits, yet nothing about the situation felt normal anymore. Civilian flights were not casually escorted by armed fighters. Captain Laura Hayes requested clarification from air traffic control, but the response dissolved beneath bursts of static that crackled across the radio with irritating persistence. Ethan frowned and adjusted another frequency. More static. The passengers could not hear the transmission, but Walter could hear its rhythm. 3 short bursts. A pause. Then 3 more. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Recognition. The sound reached deeper than memory. It landed somewhere older, somewhere untouched by decades of ordinary life. Flight attendant Megan Brooks noticed him before anyone else did. While nearly every passenger craned toward the windows or clutched their armrests, the old man in seat 16A never looked frightened. He looked disappointed. Almost as though he had hoped never to hear that sound again. She slowed as she passed his row. "Sir," she said gently, forcing a reassuring smile, "are you doing all right?" Walter finally looked up. His voice remained calm enough to steady a room, though only she heard it. "You should tell your captain not to answer the next transmission on the primary frequency." Megan blinked. "Excuse me?" Walter glanced once more toward the fighter pacing the aircraft outside. "If she answers too soon," he said quietly, "they'll assume this airplane isn't the one they're looking for." 15 minutes earlier, before frightened whispers filled the cabin and before 2 fighter jets transformed an ordinary afternoon flight into something no passenger would ever forget, Walter Bennett had stepped through the boarding door with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting without complaint. He carried a small weathered leather bag that looked older than many of the travelers already settling into their seats. His deep burgundy jacket immediately caught the attention of several passengers because it stood out against the sea of gray business suits and casual travel clothes. A young man waiting behind him sighed dramatically as Walter paused for a brief moment to thank the flight attendant greeting each passenger. "Come on, Grandpa," the traveler muttered under his breath. Some of us have connections to make. Walter heard every word, yet he simply smiled politely and continued down the aisle at the same measured pace. Years earlier he might have answered with a clever remark. Age had taught him that silence often carried far more weight than pride. Megan Brooks noticed the exchange from several rows away. She watched the older gentleman stop briefly beside a little girl struggling to lift her backpack into the overhead compartment. Without saying a word, Walter gently placed the bag inside, smiled warmly, and continued toward row 16 before the child's grateful mother even realized what had happened. There was nothing dramatic about the gesture. It was simply the habit of someone who had spent much of his life watching for people who needed help before they asked for it. Seat 16A waited beside the window exactly where Walter had requested it weeks before. Most passengers chose window seats for the view. Walter chose them for perspective. From that position he could see the wing, both engines, the changing angle of sunlight across the fuselage, and the horizon stretching endlessly beyond the aircraft. Long before satellites and digital displays filled modern cockpits, experienced pilots learned that the sky itself often revealed what instruments could not. He rested his leather bag beneath the seat, folded his burgundy jacket across his lap despite the comfortable cabin temperature, and quietly studied the world outside as though greeting an old friend. Across the aisle, First Officer Ethan Cole made his final walk through the cabin before departure. At 31 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who trusted preparation, technology, and procedure above everything else. He smiled professionally at passengers, answered routine questions, and briefly stopped when he noticed Walter examining the wing before pushback. "Beautiful day for flying," Ethan said casually. Walter nodded without looking away from the window. "The weather is honest today," he replied. "That makes flying easier." Ethan chuckled politely, assuming the comment belonged to another older traveler who enjoyed speaking in riddles. "Our systems will take good care of us either way," he answered before continuing toward the cockpit. Walter watched him disappear behind the reinforced door. "Systems always help," he whispered to himself. "Until they need someone who remembers what came before them." Megan passed again moments later offering bottled water before departure. As Walter reached for the bottle, the sleeve of his shirt shifted just enough to expose part of an old black tattoo beneath his wrist. She noticed the outline of a raven and what looked like several tiny stars before the fabric slipped back into place. It was not the kind of tattoo people usually chose today. The ink had faded with time, becoming less like decoration and more like a memory that refused to disappear. Walter thanked her softly, settled back into his seat, and turned his attention once more toward the runway as the aircraft began rolling forward, while somewhere far beyond the distant mountains, events already in motion were quietly changing the course of everyone aboard that flight. The cabin had almost settled back into an uneasy silence when the first warning appeared. It was so small that no passenger noticed it. On the primary navigation display inside the cockpit, a single amber advisory blinked for less than 2 seconds before disappearing again. Ethan Cole frowned, tapped the edge of the screen, and reviewed the system status. Everything immediately returned to green. No fault messages remained. No caution lights stayed illuminated. Modern aircraft occasionally produced harmless electronic glitches, especially when transitioning between different control sectors. He made a mental note to mention it after landing and continued monitoring the flight. Captain Laura Hayes requested their routine position update from air traffic control. Instead of the expected response, a burst of static filled the headset. It lasted only a moment before the controller repeated the instruction with unusual hesitation. Laura exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. Neither pilot said anything aloud. Outside the cockpit, the passengers remained unaware that anything had changed. Walter Bennett, however, slowly lifted his eyes from the wing. His attention was no longer fixed on the brilliant sunlight reflecting across the aluminum. It shifted toward the faint sound drifting through the forward cabin each time the cockpit door opened briefly for a flight attendant. Most people heard meaningless interference. Walter heard rhythm. 3 short bursts. A pause. 3 more. His expression became almost impossibly still. Megan Brooks approached with the calm professionalism expected of every flight attendant. She checked seat belts, reassured nervous travelers about the light turbulence, and smiled at each passenger she passed. When she reached row 16, Walter pressed the call button only once. There was no urgency in the gesture. "Is there something I can get for you, Mr. Bennett?" she asked softly after reading his boarding pass. Walter looked toward the front of the aircraft before answering. "Please tell your captain not to answer the next transmission on the primary frequency." Megan blinked, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. "I am sorry." Walter lowered his voice even further. "If the next call comes exactly the same way, ask her to wait." Megan forced a polite smile, assuming he was simply anxious. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but our flight crew is trained for situations like this." Walter nodded gently. "I know they are." He paused before adding, "That is exactly why I hope they listen." Before Megan could respond, Ethan stepped into the cabin during a brief systems check. His confident stride immediately reassured several passengers, but it stopped when he noticed the flight attendant standing beside Walter's seat. "Everything all right?" he asked. Megan hesitated. "Mr. Bennett believes the captain should ignore the next radio transmission." Ethan looked toward the elderly passenger with a puzzled smile. "Sir, I appreciate that. You are trying to help, but communications with air traffic control are not something we can simply ignore." Walter met his eyes without the slightest trace of embarrassment. "I did not say ignore it forever," he replied calmly. "Only the next one." Ethan folded his arms. "And why would we do that?" Walter turned back toward the window where the empty blue sky stretched across the horizon. "Because someone wants to know how quickly you answer." Ethan almost laughed. The explanation sounded more like the plot of an old suspense movie than anything connected to modern aviation. Every communication system on board was encrypted, monitored, and verified. Procedures existed for every imaginable situation. The idea that an elderly passenger could identify a hidden pattern from a few seconds of radio static seemed impossible. "Thank you for your concern," Ethan said politely, although the confidence in his voice carried a hint of dismissal. "We will continue following standard procedure." Walter inclined his head respectfully. "I expected you would." Ethan walked back toward the cockpit convinced the conversation was over, but Megan remained standing beside seat 16 for one more second. She could not explain why. Perhaps it was the absolute certainty in Walter's voice, or perhaps it was the strange feeling that he had not offered an opinion at all. He had spoken as though he remembered something the rest of the world had quietly forgotten. Then, before either of them could say another word, two dark shapes appeared far ahead against the brilliant afternoon sky, closing the distance with astonishing precision. The first fighter closed the distance with remarkable precision until its sleek gray silhouette filled nearly half the window beside seat 16. Gasps spread through the cabin as passengers reached for their phones, hoping to capture a moment none of them had ever imagined witnessing from a commercial flight. The aircraft remained steady, yet the presence of the military jet transformed every vibration into something that felt heavier. Megan Brooks instinctively looked toward Walter Bennett. He was not watching the fighter itself. His eyes remained fixed on the narrow strip of sunlight reflecting across its canopy. It was almost as though he was reading information hidden inside the movement rather than admiring the machine. Ethan Cole emerged from the cockpit once more after another unsuccessful attempt to clear the persistent radio interference. His expression remained controlled, but the confidence he carried earlier had begun to compete with growing uncertainty. He noticed Megan still standing near row 16 and immediately recognized the direction of her attention. "Everything still all right here?" he asked. Megan hesitated before answering. Mr. Bennett said something else. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Walter calmly folded his hands over the burgundy jacket resting across his lap. "I only suggested that your captain wait before answering the next transmission." Ethan offered a courteous smile that barely concealed his skepticism. "Sir, Commercial aviation follows established procedures. We cannot delay communication because of intuition. Walter nodded respectfully. No. But sometimes procedure depends on understanding why someone is asking the question. Ethan leaned slightly closer. And you believe you know that? Walter looked out the window again. I believe I have heard that pattern before. Ethan allowed himself a quiet laugh. Radio interference is not exactly unusual. Walter did not argue. Neither is history repeating itself when people stop recognizing it. The answer lingered between them for several seconds. Megan sensed that neither man was trying to win the conversation. They were speaking from two completely different worlds. One trusted systems built over decades of technological progress. The other trusted experience earned long before those systems existed. Suddenly the aircraft encountered a gentle pocket of turbulence. It was not severe, but enough for an overhead compartment several rows behind Walter to shift with a dull thump before settling back into place. Walter instinctively reached across the aisle to steady the shoulder of an elderly passenger who had been startled by the movement. As he did, the cuff of his shirt slipped beneath the sleeve of his jacket. Megan caught sight of the faded tattoo more clearly than before. A black raven with its wings spread across weathered skin. Above it rested 6 small stars arranged in a deliberate arc. Beneath them ran a narrow crimson line that had faded almost to rust with age. It did not resemble modern body art. It looked older. Purposeful. Almost official. Ethan noticed Megan staring at Walter's forearm. He glanced briefly at the tattoo before dismissing it with a small shrug. Military souvenir, he asked casually. Walter slowly adjusted his sleeve until the tattoo disappeared once again beneath the fabric. Just a reminder, he answered. Of what? Ethan asked. Walter smiled gently without looking at him. That some promises never retire. Before Ethan could respond, another burst of static echoed faintly from the cockpit speakers through the partially open door. 3 short signals. A pause. 3 more. Walter closed his eyes for the briefest moment. His breathing remained perfectly steady, but something behind his calm expression had changed. It was no longer the face of an elderly passenger observing an unusual flight. It was the face of a man listening to a voice he had not expected to hear again after more than half a century. Megan quietly reached into her apron pocket and opened the notes application on her phone. Without saying a word to anyone, she carefully sketched the unusual raven emblem she had just seen, unable to shake the feeling that the forgotten symbol on Walter Bennett's arm mattered far more than anyone on that airplane yet understood. Captain Laura Hayes kept her eyes on the horizon while another burst of static rolled through her headset. This time the interference was followed by a voice that was clear enough to understand but strange enough to raise every instinct she had developed during more than 2 decades in the cockpit. Civilian Flight 721, adjust heading 180 immediately and acknowledge. Before she could answer, the transmission dissolved back into silence. Ethan Cole quickly verified the frequency. The signal checks out, he said, although uncertainty had begun replacing the confidence that had guided him since takeoff. Laura did not respond immediately. Something about the timing felt wrong. Air traffic control normally identified itself first. This transmission had not. Outside the windshield, the 2 gray fighters shifted position with flawless precision. One climbed slightly above the airliner while the second drifted lower toward the left wing, maintaining perfect separation as if rehearsing a carefully planned formation. Several passengers gasped as the lower fighter edged closer, its sharp lines glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Walter Bennett watched every movement without blinking. He was not impressed by the aircraft itself. He was studying the conversation taking place through motion alone. Tiny adjustments. Deliberate spacing. Silent questions asked without a single spoken word. Megan remained near row 16, unable to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside her. Walter quietly pressed the call button once again. Please, he said gently, tell your captain not to change course until she verifies the challenge. Megan frowned. Challenge? Walter nodded almost imperceptibly. Those fighters are asking a question. Before she could ask another, Ethan stepped back into the cabin. Sir, he said, maintaining professional courtesy, I understand you have concerns, but military intercept procedures are handled between the cockpit and the proper authorities. Walter looked up calmly. Exactly. Ethan folded his arms. Then I am sure you also understand that passengers cannot participate. Walter offered a faint smile that carried neither offense nor pride. I am not trying to participate. He glanced toward the fighter sliding closer to the wingtip. I am trying to keep your crew from answering the wrong question. Ethan shook his head. There is no hidden question. We received a heading change. That is all. Walter slowly turned back toward the window. No, he replied quietly. If they truly wanted you to turn immediately, the fighter would already be crossing ahead of your nose. Ethan instinctively looked outside. The fighter remained exactly where it was, steady as stone against the endless sky. Walter continued before Ethan could dismiss the observation. See the distance between them. They are waiting. One watches your aircraft. The other watches your response. Megan felt a chill despite the comfortable cabin temperature. Ethan said nothing for several seconds. He knew intercept formations were carefully choreographed, but he had never considered that spacing itself could communicate intent. His training focused on procedures, not silent conversations written across the sky. Suddenly the cockpit speaker crackled again. Another transmission arrived, nearly identical to the first. Civilian Flight 721, acknowledge heading change immediately. Laura rested her hand above the radio switch but did not press it. Ethan looked toward her through the open cockpit door. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before lowering her hand again. Walter quietly closed his eyes. For the first time since boarding, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest trace of relief. The captain had waited. Outside, almost instantly, the lead fighter dipped its left wing by only a few degrees before returning to level flight. The movement lasted less than a second. Most passengers never noticed it. Walter did. His expression grew solemn. Good, he whispered almost to himself. They know someone on this airplane still remembers how to listen. The cabin lights flickered so briefly that most passengers assumed they had imagined it, but Walter Bennett noticed something far more important than the lights. The lead fighter eased a few feet farther away from the airliner while the second aircraft held perfectly steady beside the left wing. It was not random movement. It was measured, deliberate, almost respectful. Walter slowly opened his eyes and followed the reflection dancing across the polished aluminum outside his window. Somewhere deep beneath the steady rhythm of the engines, another memory began stirring. A sudden ripple of light crossed the cabin as the afternoon sun struck the window at a different angle. Walter instinctively reached toward the glass, not to touch it, but as though measuring the changing reflection. His sleeve slipped back once again. This time the raven tattoo was fully exposed. The faded black wings. Stretched across weathered skin, 6 small stars arched above the bird, and beneath them ran the narrow crimson stripe that had nearly disappeared after decades beneath the sun. Megan Brooks noticed it immediately. The symbol no longer looked like an ordinary military tattoo. It looked like an emblem that had once belonged somewhere official, somewhere hidden from public view. Before Walter adjusted his sleeve, Megan quietly lifted her phone and opened the sketch she had started moments earlier. She carefully added the final details she had just seen. She did not know why she felt compelled to preserve the image. She only knew that something inside her refused to dismiss it as coincidence. Across the aisle, Ethan Cole caught her doing it. "You really think that old tattoo means something?" he asked with a polite smile. Megan hesitated before answering. "I do not know. But he keeps noticing things before they happen." Ethan glanced toward Walter. "Experience can make people observant, but that does not mean they understand what is happening today. Walter overheard every word. Instead of taking offense, he quietly replied, "Every generation believes its challenges are completely new. Most of them are simply familiar lessons wearing different uniforms." Ethan folded his arms. "With respect, aviation today is not what it was 50 years ago." Walter nodded in complete agreement. "You are right. The airplanes are different. The computers are extraordinary. The people are still human." The answer lingered longer than Ethan expected. Before he could respond, another gentle vibration rolled through the aircraft. An overhead reading light flickered, then stabilized. Outside, the lead fighter briefly caught the sunlight, its canopy flashing like polished glass. Walter's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The reflection triggered something older than thought itself. For a single heartbeat, the bright afternoon dissolved into another sky entirely. He remembered sunlight striking another canopy many years earlier. He remembered the same brief flash used as a silent confirmation when radio discipline had to remain absolute. He remembered looking toward 6 aircraft instead of 2, each waiting for a decision that could not be spoken aloud. The memory vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the steady hum of the passenger jet and the smell of recycled cabin air. Walter lowered his hand and carefully pulled the sleeve of his burgundy jacket back over the Raven emblem. He had spent decades making certain that symbol remained unnoticed. Today it seemed determined to reveal itself one piece at a time. Megan slipped her phone back into her pocket, but curiosity had already replaced routine. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was certain she had seen that Raven before, perhaps in an old museum photograph or a forgotten military display. She simply could not remember where. Outside the window, the 2 fighters continued their silent escort beneath the endless blue sky, while inside the quiet man in seat 16 carried a history no one around him had yet begun to understand. The bright cabin slowly dissolved behind Walter Bennett's steady gaze until the polished aluminum wing outside his window became something entirely different. In his mind, sunlight disappeared beneath a moonless sky where every shape was reduced to shadow and instinct mattered more than visibility. The quiet hum of modern jet engines faded into the distant echo of older turbines cutting through cold night air. There had been no satellite navigation then. No moving maps. No digital terrain displays glowing across glass cockpits. There had only been darkness, disciplined crews, and a handful of pilots who learned to trust the language of mountains, wind, and silence. Walter remembered tightening the faded red identification scarf around his left wrist before climbing into the cockpit. Every member of the formation wore one during that operation. It was never intended as decoration. If anyone became separated after landing, that narrow strip of crimson fabric would tell exhausted rescuers exactly who belonged together. 6 aircraft waited in complete radio silence along the edge of an isolated runway. Their engines idled softly beneath blackout conditions while crews exchanged only brief hand signals. Nobody smiled. Nobody spoke about the risks ahead. They all understood why they had volunteered. Walter climbed into the lead aircraft and looked across the line one final time. 6 silhouettes. 6 trusted friends. 6 lives that depended on every decision made during the next few hours. The radio remained silent until the wheels finally left the runway. Then a calm voice reached his headset. "Lead, all aircraft are with you." Walter answered with only 2 words. "Maintain spacing." Nothing more needed to be said. Far below, jagged mountain ridges disappeared beneath layers of darkness while thin bands of moonlight revealed narrow valleys that could either conceal them or trap them forever if a single turn came too early. Modern pilots would have relied on detailed digital charts. Walter relied on something less tangible. He watched the angle of starlight against distant peaks. He measured the changing sound of the wind crossing the canopy. He counted seconds between each subtle correction until the formation flowed through the mountains almost like a single living aircraft instead of 6 separate machines. A younger pilot broke the silence only once. "Lead, visibility is dropping." Walter looked toward the faint outline of another ridge ahead. "Do not chase the mountain," he answered calmly. "Follow the sky above it." The response confused the young pilot for only a moment before understanding replaced uncertainty. The formation adjusted together without another unnecessary word. Years later, Walter would forget countless dates, countless ceremonies, and even many names written across official records, but he never forgot that night or the quiet confidence shared between people who trusted one another completely without needing long explanations. The memory slowly dissolved as another beam of afternoon sunlight crossed the cabin window. The cold mountain air vanished. The scent of aviation fuel became recycled cabin air once again. Walter blinked and found himself back in seat 16, surrounded by nervous travelers who could not possibly know that the calm elderly passenger beside them had once guided 6 aircraft through darkness without a single electronic display. Megan noticed the distant look lingering in his eyes before it quietly disappeared behind the same gentle expression he had worn since boarding. Outside, the two fighters remained perfectly aligned with the airliner, their disciplined formation reminding Walter that although airplanes changed across generations, the finest pilots still spoke the same silent language that no machine could ever fully replace. Walter Bennett slowly exhaled as the memory faded, leaving only the soft vibration of the passenger cabin and the endless blue sky beyond the window. The past had returned for only a few seconds, yet it lingered behind his eyes with remarkable clarity. He gently rested one hand on the burgundy jacket across his lap, almost as though grounding himself in the present. Around him, the atmosphere inside the aircraft continued changing in subtle ways. Conversations had grown quieter. Even those passengers still recording the fighters outside had lowered their voices, sensing that whatever was happening belonged to a world they did not understand. Megan Brooks remained unusually thoughtful. During her next walk through the cabin, she could not stop thinking about the faded raven emblem she had copied onto her phone. The image tugged at a memory just beyond reach. It was not something she had learned during flight attendant training. It came from somewhere else. Perhaps a museum visit with her grandfather years ago. Perhaps an article she had stumbled across while waiting in an airport. She simply could not place it. Unable to ignore her curiosity any longer, she quietly stepped into the forward galley and opened her phone again. The aircraft wireless connection was limited, but a few cached search results from earlier browsing remained available. She enlarged her rough sketch beside several military aviation photographs stored from previous searches she had made while planning a family vacation to Dayton, Ohio. One photograph immediately caught her attention. It showed a faded display inside the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Most visitors would have focused on the aircraft suspended from the ceiling. Megan noticed something else. In the corner of an old black and white photograph, barely visible on the sleeve of a flight suit, appeared the outline of a raven surrounded by small stars. The image quality was too poor to confirm anything, yet her heartbeat quickened. She enlarged the photograph until the pixels blurred. The resemblance was unmistakable. She hurried toward the cockpit and quietly showed Captain Laura Hayes the comparison. Laura studied both images for several seconds before looking back toward the cabin through the partially open cockpit door. "It could be coincidence," she said cautiously. Megan nodded. "I thought so too. Until he started recognizing things before they happened." Laura remained silent. She had spent enough years flying to respect coincidence, but she respected patterns even more. Walter had predicted the hesitation before the second transmission. He had recognized the fighters were waiting rather than forcing an immediate maneuver. Most unsettling of all, his calm had never once appeared rehearsed. It felt familiar, almost professional. Ethan glanced over from his seat. "What are you two looking at?" Laura handed him the phone. He studied the faded museum photograph before returning it with a polite shrug. "Old military unit. There are thousands of them." Megan accepted the phone but did not argue. Deep down, she sensed the photograph represented only part of a much larger story. At that exact moment another burst of static rolled through the cockpit speakers. It sounded almost identical to the earlier transmissions, yet Walter lifted his head before anyone else reacted. His eyes shifted toward the lead fighter, which had begun climbing slightly higher above the airliner. The second fighter maintained its precise position near the left wing without drifting a single foot. Walter watched the formation for several long seconds before quietly whispering words that no one except the nearest passenger happened to hear. "They have finished asking. Now they are waiting for someone else to answer." The passenger frowned in confusion, assuming the elderly man was talking to himself. Up front, Laura slowly reached toward another radio selector while Ethan reviewed the communication panel again. Neither of them realized that somewhere far beyond the cockpit, another voice had already entered the conversation, and before long, every assumption aboard the aircraft was about to change. Captain Laura Hayes kept her hand suspended above the communication panel while the steady hum of the engine seemed louder than ever before. Every checklist she had memorized urged her to follow established procedure, yet every instinct sharpened by thousands of flight hours whispered that something about the situation remained incomplete. Ethan Cole reviewed the navigation displays again, searching for any indication that the aircraft itself had become the source of the confusion. Every primary system appeared healthy. The autopilot remained engaged. Fuel balance was normal. Flight controls responded exactly as expected. Yet one detail refused to disappear. A secondary data channel continued refreshing far more frequently than it should have. "That is strange," Ethan murmured as he opened another systems page. Laura leaned closer. "Can you isolate it?" Ethan frowned. It should not even be requesting updates this often. Outside the windshield, the lead fighter maintained its position while the second aircraft remained perfectly aligned beside the left wing, neither one making the aggressive movements associated with an emergency intercept. They looked patient. Almost protective. Back in the cabin, Walter Bennett slowly shifted his attention from the window toward the ceiling for only a moment before quietly closing his eyes. He counted each faint electronic tone hidden beneath the ordinary sounds of the aircraft. When he opened them again, his calm expression returned. Megan approached once more, no longer dismissing his observations as coincidence. She lowered her voice. "Mr. Bennett, if there is something you recognize, please tell me." Walter looked at her kindly. "Your airplane is not the problem." Megan blinked. "Then what is?" Walter glanced toward the cockpit. "Something is asking it to become something it is not." She frowned, struggling to understand. Walter continued carefully. "Long ago we learned that the safest response was not always the fastest one. Sometimes you waited because the first answer revealed more than the first question." At that exact moment another brief vibration passed through the cabin. Ethan immediately disconnected one non-essential display to compare incoming data. The unusual activity remained. Laura watched him in silence before making a decision that surprised even herself. "Disconnect the secondary data link for 10 seconds, she instructed. Ethan looked up. "That is outside our normal sequence." Laura nodded. "I know. Do it anyway." Ethan complied. The moment the secondary link was interrupted, the repeated requests vanished from the system page. Almost instantly the lead fighter rolled gently a few degrees before returning to level flight, as though acknowledging a message invisible to everyone else aboard. Walter noticed the movement and quietly smiled to himself. "There it is," he whispered. Ethan stared at the now stable display in disbelief. The abnormal traffic just stopped. Laura kept her voice steady. "Reconnect it." Ethan restored the link. Within seconds the unusual requests returned exactly as before. Neither pilot spoke. The evidence unfolding in front of them no longer felt like coincidence. Megan looked back toward Walter, whose eyes had already returned to the endless horizon outside seat 16. She suddenly realized that he had never claimed to know secret technology. He had simply recognized a pattern because he had lived through generations of different systems built around the same human decisions. Laura reached for a different communication selector, one rarely needed during routine airline operations. "Let us try the guard frequency," she said quietly. Ethan acknowledged the change and switched channels. For several seconds only silence answered them. Then the static cleared with remarkable precision. A calm, disciplined military voice emerged from the speaker, stronger and clearer than any transmission they had received since the fighters first appeared. Every sound inside the cockpit seemed to disappear as the unknown voice spoke its first measured sentence. "Civilian Flight 721, identify the individual who advised you to delay your response." The voice remained steady across the guard frequency, carrying the unmistakable calm of someone trained to speak only when every word mattered. "Civilian Flight 721, identify the individual who advised you to delay your response." Captain Laura Hayes looked at Ethan Cole. Ethan looked back at the communication panel as though another explanation might suddenly appear among the glowing displays. None did. Laura finally answered. "The advice came from a passenger." A brief silence followed. Then the same voice returned. "Please confirm. Is the passenger willing to speak?" Laura hesitated for only a moment before standing from her seat. She stepped into the cabin, where dozens of anxious eyes immediately turned toward her. Her gaze settled on Walter Bennett. He remained exactly where he had been since takeoff, hands folded over the burgundy jacket resting across his lap, watching the endless sky beyond the window. Laura approached with quiet respect. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "someone on the military frequency is requesting to speak with you." Several nearby passengers exchanged confused glances. Ethan stepped into the aisle carrying the handheld cockpit microphone. Only an hour earlier he had politely dismissed the elderly passenger's observations. Now he extended the microphone with both hands, unsure why the gesture suddenly felt more significant than any checklist he had completed that day. Walter looked at the microphone but made no move to accept it. "Who is asking?" he said calmly. Laura answered honestly. "They did not give a name." Walter nodded once. "Then they are following procedure." He slowly accepted the microphone, his weathered fingers wrapping around it with a familiarity that neither pilot failed to notice. For a long second he said nothing at all. The cabin grew so quiet that even the engines seemed distant. Children stopped whispering. Cell phones slowly lowered. Megan Brooks watched from only a few feet away, her heartbeat echoing louder than the gentle vibration beneath the cabin floor. Walter finally lifted the microphone. "This is Walter Bennett speaking." Silence answered him. 5 full seconds passed without a single transmission. Ethan glanced toward Laura, wondering if the connection had failed. Then the military voice returned, quieter than before. "Mr. Bennett, do you have a historical tactical identifier?" Walter closed his eyes. The question carried him across decades in an instant. Countless names had faded from memory. Countless faces had blurred with time. Yet one part of his life had never truly belonged to history. It had simply been left there. He opened his eyes and looked through the window toward the lead fighter flying faithfully against the afternoon sun. His reflection overlapped with the aircraft for the briefest moment, as though two different generations shared the same sky. Walter drew one slow breath before answering. "I was told that identifier was retired a long time ago." The reply that came back was immediate. "Sir, please confirm." Walter lowered his eyes for a heartbeat. The raven beneath his sleeve seemed almost to stir with the memory. His voice remained quiet enough that anyone listening had to lean forward to hear it. "Call sign." He paused. Not because he had forgotten, but because speaking it aloud meant opening a door he had deliberately kept closed for more than 50 years. Every passenger waited without understanding why the cabin suddenly felt suspended between two different worlds. Walter finally completed the sentence. "Raven 6. Nothing happened. No dramatic alarm sounded. No sudden announcement followed. Instead, absolute silence settled across the guard frequency. Even the faint background static disappeared. Ethan stared at the microphone. Laura stopped breathing for a single heartbeat. Outside the window, both F-35 fighters maintained their flawless formation without moving an inch, as though the entire sky itself had paused after hearing a name that history had almost forgotten. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet to everyone aboard the aircraft it felt immeasurable. Captain Laura Hayes held her breath as the guard frequency remained completely still. There was no static. No acknowledgement. No background chatter from military controllers. It was as though every voice on the network had suddenly stopped speaking. Walter Bennett quietly lowered the microphone a few inches but did not release it. His expression never changed. He had expected silence long before he expected recognition. Ethan Cole looked anxiously toward the communication panel, wondering whether the transmission had been lost. Before he could check another setting, a different voice entered the frequency. It was older, deeper, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Raven 6, please remain on this channel. Every word was deliberate. Every syllable carried extraordinary restraint. Walter slowly raised the microphone again. I am here. Another pause followed before the officer spoke once more. Sir, this is Colonel Daniel Mercer, Falcon Lead. Walter closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The name meant nothing to most people listening inside the cabin, but somewhere in the quiet corners of his memory another face began to emerge. Daniel continued speaking, although the confidence normally expected from a fighter squadron commander had softened into something far more personal. My father told me that if I ever heard the name Raven 6, I was to remember one sentence before anything else. Walter remained silent. Around him, every passenger leaned forward without realizing it. Even the smallest child sitting across the aisle had stopped asking questions. Daniel drew one careful breath before finishing the thought. He said that if you had not turned back for him, I would never have been born. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the sunlight pouring through the window. The cabin around him disappeared once again, replaced not by dramatic memories but by a single quiet image of 6 aircraft disappearing into darkness and one young pilot smiling with exhausted relief after reaching home. Walter answered gently. Thomas Mercer always believed I deserved more credit than I earned. Daniel responded immediately. My father never believed that for a second. Ethan slowly lowered his hands from the cockpit microphone, unable to hide the disbelief spreading across his face. The elderly passenger he had politely dismissed throughout the flight was now being addressed by the commander of the fighter formation with unmistakable reverence. Megan Brooks felt tears gathering in her eyes without fully understanding why. Nothing dramatic had happened. No medals had appeared. No official announcement had been made. Yet the quiet gratitude in the colonel's voice carried more weight than any ceremony she had ever witnessed. Outside the windows, the lead F-35 gently increased altitude by only a few feet while the wing aircraft held perfect alignment beside the airliner. Inside the cockpit of Falcon Lead, Daniel Mercer briefly reached behind his seat and removed a small laminated photograph that had remained tucked beneath his emergency checklist for years. The edges had faded with time. It showed 2 young military aviators standing beside an aging aircraft after a successful mission. One of them rested a hand on the other's shoulder. Around the wrist of the taller pilot was a narrow crimson scarf. Daniel looked from the photograph to the passenger aircraft flying beneath his formation. Sir, he said quietly over the radio, my father carried that picture until the day he passed away. He told me heroes rarely looked like heroes after enough time had passed. He said I would know you because you would never introduce yourself first. Walter smiled faintly, his weathered eyes reflecting both the afternoon sun and memories that had quietly waited more than half a century for someone else to remember them. Colonel Daniel Mercer allowed several quiet seconds to pass before speaking again. No one interrupted the silence. It had become something sacred, a space where respect traveled farther than words ever could. When his voice finally returned across the guard frequency, it carried the warmth of a son honoring a promise made long ago. Raven 6, Falcon Lead requests permission to render honors. Walter Bennett lowered his eyes and smiled with the humility of a man who had spent decades avoiding recognition rather than seeking it. "Colonel, your mission is to protect the people on this airplane. That is honor enough." Daniel answered without hesitation. "With respect, sir, those responsibilities are not in conflict today." Captain Laura Hayes listened carefully, realizing she was witnessing a conversation that belonged to history instead of routine aviation. She quietly disengaged the microphone and simply allowed the exchange to continue. Outside the windows, the lead fighter eased forward by only a few yards while the second aircraft drifted slightly lower before both settled into an entirely new formation. Ethan Cole watched through the cockpit windshield as the movement unfolded with breathtaking precision. "Captain," he whispered, "they are changing formation." Laura nodded slowly. "Not for an intercept." Neither pilot said another word. The passengers noticed it almost immediately. The fighter beside the left wing moved gently ahead until it aligned perfectly with seat 16, matching the airliner's speed so smoothly that it appeared suspended in the sky. Sunlight reflected across the canopy, making it impossible to see the pilot's face for only a moment. Then, as the angle changed, the reflection disappeared. Walter could clearly see the pilot looking directly toward the passenger window. The pilot slowly raised a gloved hand to the side of the flight helmet in a deliberate salute. No sudden motion. No theatrical display. Just one perfectly disciplined gesture offered across two generations of aviators separated by more than half a century. Walter remained seated. His shoulders relaxed as he quietly returned the salute with two steady fingers lifted to his forehead. Around him, every passenger watched in complete silence. Even those who knew nothing about military aviation instinctively understood they were witnessing something deeply personal. The second F-35 then climbed several hundred feet above the airliner before banking gracefully to the left. The lead fighter mirrored the movement a heartbeat later. Together they crossed ahead of the commercial aircraft in a flawless ceremonial formation before returning to their escort positions with extraordinary precision. The choreography lasted only seconds, yet it transformed the endless blue sky into a place of remembrance. Inside Falcon Lead, Daniel Mercer completed the maneuver before pressing the transmit switch one final time. Raven 6. On behalf of every pilot who came home because someone chose to turn back, welcome home, sir. Walter closed his eyes as the words settled gently over the cabin. For years he had believed the greatest missions disappeared with the people who flew them. Now he understood that memory sometimes traveled quietly through generations, waiting for the right moment to return. Ethan slowly removed his captain's cap and held it respectfully against his chest without thinking about the gesture. Megan Brooks wiped a single tear from her cheek before smiling. Captain Laura Hayes looked once toward seat 16, then toward the fighters holding their silent station outside, and understood that the finest lesson of her career had not come from a simulator, a manual, or an instructor. It had come from an elderly passenger who never once asked anyone to believe who he had been because he had never stopped showing them who he was. The wheels touched the runway with barely a whisper, and for the first time since the strange encounter had begun, the passengers allowed themselves to breathe without hesitation. As the aircraft rolled steadily toward the terminal, the two F-35 fighters climbed gracefully into the afternoon sky before separating in opposite directions, their silver outlines slowly disappearing into the sunlight until nothing remained except a clear horizon. Inside the cabin, nobody rushed to unfasten a seat belt. Nobody reached impatiently for an overhead bag. The silence that filled the airplane was no longer born from uncertainty. It had become respect. Captain Laura Hayes completed the final checklist before standing to address the passengers. She opened the cockpit door, looked briefly toward seat 16, then simply smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly, "thank you for your patience today." It was a short announcement, yet every person aboard understood that some moments required no further explanation. The boarding door finally opened, but before anyone moved, several dark government vehicles appeared beyond the terminal windows. A small military sedan stopped quietly beside the aircraft. No flashing lights. No large ceremony. No cameras. Moments later, a single Air Force officer climbed the stairs carrying only a service cap beneath his arm. Colonel Daniel Mercer entered the cabin alone. Every passenger instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward row 16 without being asked. Daniel stopped beside Walter Bennett and stood perfectly still. Neither man spoke immediately. The colonel slowly placed his service cap on his head, came to attention, and offered the crispest salute of his career. Walter looked at the younger officer with gentle eyes filled not with pride, but gratitude. He slowly returned the salute before lowering his hand. Daniel smiled quietly. "Sir, I have wanted to do that since I was a little boy." Walter gave a soft chuckle. "Your father always exaggerated." Daniel shook his head. "No, sir. He simply refused to forget." Walter reached inside the burgundy jacket folded across his lap and carefully removed a small cloth patch that had been stitched to the inner lining for decades. Time had faded the black raven almost gray, and the 6 stars above it had nearly disappeared, yet the emblem remained unmistakable. He held it for a long moment before placing it gently into Daniel's hands. "Your father helped carry this story too," Walter said. "It belongs with those who will remember it now." Daniel accepted the patch as though it were the most valuable object he had ever held. His voice almost failed him. "I will protect it, sir." Walter smiled warmly. "Do not protect the patch. Protect the people beside you." That was always the mission. Ethan Cole finally stepped forward, his confidence replaced by sincere humility. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I believed the newest systems could answer every question." Walter rested a reassuring hand on the younger pilot's shoulder. "Never apologize for trusting your training," he replied. "Just remember that every checklist was written by someone who survived long enough to teach it." Ethan nodded silently, knowing he would carry those words into every cockpit for the rest of his career. Megan Brooks watched Walter gather his worn leather bag as though he were leaving after an ordinary flight. There was no entourage waiting for him. No reporters. No applause. He thanked each crew member with the same quiet kindness he had shown when boarding the airplane, then walked slowly toward the open door beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. As he stepped onto the stairs, he paused only once to look back through the cabin. Seat 16 was already empty again, just another window beside another aisle to anyone passing through in the future. Yet everyone who had witnessed that journey understood that some legends never announce themselves, never demand recognition, and never measure greatness by the number of people who remember their names. They are remembered instead by every life that safely finds its way home, because respect is never given by rank alone. It is quietly earned, faithfully carried, and one day, when the moment is right, simply recognized.